It's Martin Week. More specifically, it's 1970s Martin Week. Got a D18 and a D35. Both need various operations performed on them. The D18 is getting a neck reset and some crack work. The D35 needs a setup and a few dings filled and a little bit of care here and there.
Oh, and it's also missing a back brace.
1970s Martins. That's a decade which is usually described as a low point in the company's history. The feeling is that Martin may have got just a little too big for its britches and lost sight of what made it great. Through the 60s, they'd experienced unparalleled, exponential growth in sales on the wings of the folk and the rock scenes. All the boomers were picking up their instruments, forming bands. Martin could trade on that reputation it's been building for a century. It was seen as the pinnacle of guitar making, so they were riding high. Some of that expansion could be attributed to Frank Martin,
who was the fifth generation of the Martin dynasty.
He'd been working as vice president under his father, C.F. Martin III, throughout the 60s, and he did get them into a larger facility that could accommodate them building like 20,000 guitars a year in 1970, which was a huge step up for them. Along with that came some money, and Martin started acquiring other companies like Vega, which is a banjo maker, Darko, which is a string producer. They bought into a drumstick operation, and they even went overseas to acquire Levin, the Swedish maker. That's getting to be a pretty big umbrella for a family-run business. And it was at that point that C.F. Martin III decided to step down and let his son take over. And Frank had issues. He didn't seem to really be cut out for the president's role, other than in some stereotypical ways, because he liked to drink. He liked sports cars. He played an awful lot of golf. He underwrote a basketball team and put the players on the payroll during the off-season, so like basically no-show jobs, if you know what I mean. And probably most importantly, he failed to recognize the threat that Japanese guitars, which were essentially clones of his own product, were going to have when they really hit the American market in force. Add to that the fact that he did not have a good relationship with his workers. He publicly blamed them when profits went down, rather than the whole bloated marketing scheme and leveraged diversification that he was doing. And banks started calling in his loans. It got so bad that the workers went out on strike. They joined with the local union, and they were out for part of 1977 and 78. Martin tried to keep some guitars coming off the line using management for labor with predictable results. Very similar to what's going on with John Deere this year. So yeah, there are 70s Martins with bridges that are way out of position. Eventually the board asked Frank to resign, and they promoted his son Chris IV, who was very young at the time, such that his grandfather actually came out of retirement to help.
Oh, and he had cancer at the time.
It was necessary to sort of right the ship and get the confidence back with their banks so that they wouldn't be forced into bankruptcy. Physically, a 70s dreadnought looks pretty much like the ones that came earlier. One of the visual cues is they did switch to a black pickguard, probably to save on cost, because the tortoise stuff, it's a very hands-on process, not easy to get right, and it was being done in small batches by very few companies, and it was going up in price. So they went with a black one, and the problem is most of them curl up like a leaf of kale, and they just sort of fall off, because unfortunately it's not a very stable plastic. This one here isn't original. This is a replacement, and I'm going to have to make another one for the D18. Inside, the design is pretty much the same, but the proportions got a bit beefy. The braces got big, probably in an attempt to cut down on warranty repairs. Because that big jump in production, it's one thing. You can take someone fresh from high school, you teach them how to glue in the lining strips or operate the side bender or put in the frets. But repair people just aren't that easy to find. And at that scale that they were running, if just like 1% of everything you build comes back for their much vaunted lifetime warranty, that you could be looking at thousands of guitars a year that need to be fixed. And those aren't bringing in any money, but you're paying people to do the work. So make the braces heavier, boys. In the 70s, it got a bit out of hand sometimes. Not to say that there aren't really great 70s Martins, because there are. It's like anything. Every era has its dogs, and it's got some absolute classics. Here's a 1976 Martin D18, 45-year-old dreadnought. If it hasn't had a neck reset by now, it's probably in need of one. In this case, the action's around 12/64. I think this one probably sat around for a lot of years with some heavier strings on it because the neck is showing a lot of relief. It's over 25 thousandths at the 6th fret, which is triple what it should be. Martin's spec is around 6 thousandths. I'd be happy if it had 10. The issue is, of course, this guitar predates Martin's use of an adjustable truss rod. It has a steel reinforcing bar, or square tube probably in this case. But how do we deal with that much forward warpage? Traditionally, the solution is to yank the frets and put in some new ones with thicker tangs or heavier barbs on them. Then they force the fret slots apart, bending the fretboard and the rest of the neck into straightness. That's called compression fretting. There's a bit of an art to it. You could also put it in a neck jig to hold the shape it takes under string tension and then dress off the top of the board. You couldn't get that much out of the frets themselves. You would be into the rosewood before you've got them, where you want them. So you would definitely have to take the frets out one way or the other. But maybe we don't want to refret. Maybe the frets are in good shape. Maybe it's not in the budget. For a US-made Martin it usually is, but I see a lot of guitars that are worth $700, $800, The choice gets a lot harder then. I've been toying with the idea of making a neck heater for some time. In the past I've made a makeshift rig using my side-bending heat blanket, and it felt kind of sketchy. Commercial-made neck heaters aren't that easy to come by these days. They were a thing in the 70s and 80s. Virtually no one makes them anymore. Making your own has some obstacles too. The main thing is, how are you going to heat it? I thought about having a custom silicone heat blanket made up, just like the thing I use to take off bridges. But the custom sizes, that gets pretty expensive. And if you're actually doing guitar repair for a living, that comes into play, If you're not going to earn back the cost of the tool quickly, and I might only need the thing once every 3 or 4 years, you sort of start weighing it in your mind, and I could use that money for other things, right? Then about 6 months ago, I was watching my countryman, Dave, from Dave's World of Fun Stuff, and he came up with a design that does what it needs to do, and it's pretty economical.
So cheers to Dave for doing the legwork and coming up with these inexpensive aluminum resistance heaters on Amazon. That brings down the price to about a quarter of what it would have been, based on the fact that I can control these through my variable DC power supply. These are going to get stuck to the thick-walled aluminum rectangle there using high-temperature silicone gasket material. It's like caulking that can take the heat of an engine, which is much higher than I'm going to subject this thing to. So these get put inside the tube and pressed into place, and I'll fill up the ends of the tube with more silicone to try and make it more efficient.
Okay, got my unit all set up, tested it out, and it gets hot, folks. All the wiring has high temp rated silicone insulation, so it's not going to melt or anything. I'm measuring it at about 60 degrees Celsius, which is 140 something Fahrenheit, but I think it might actually be hotter than that. My thermometer is kind of unreliable now. The heaters are they rate at 70 Celsius when running at that particular voltage. Somehow I managed to buy the 24 volt version of these heaters by accident. On the same page you could select either 12 volt or 24. It was a little bit misleading. Not a huge deal for me because my power supply goes up to 30 volts, but if someone else were to make one, and I'm not suggesting you do, it could be an issue if you had a smaller rated power supply. Heat bending, by its very nature, is kind of unpredictable. There are unknowable variables involved. Mainly, the wood is going to spring back a certain amount after bending. Just one of those things that wood likes to do, even after it's been heated. One of the ideas is that the heat is going to slightly soften the glue between the fingerboard and the neck. So you're kind of slipping that joint and making it re-solidify in a new position. Or it's a theory. I mean, it's more likely that the wood of the neck is physically being bent as well. It might be a combination of those two. So if I want to reverse this curve and end up with a neck that's basically straight, I'm going to have to overbend it into a slight back bow, knowing that I'm going to lose some of that with the spring back that's going to occur and when string tension goes on it. The way this thing works is it's going to be held over the fretboard, or actually under it because heat rises, and we're going to invert everything to take advantage of that. But not tight against the plane of the frets, all of them, because there needs to be some breathing room so that we can pull that neck up into the back bow that we need. So it'll sit on shims on either end and be clamped around the 7th fret where the relief is greatest. Now it would be nice if we could figure out how tall those shims should be such that when we've pulled that 7th fret area up into contact with the underside of the heater, we know that it's bent to the right degree. And I think I've figured out a plan for that. To start off with, we have to deal with the fret height. It's a pretty consistent 30 thousandths of an inch in this guitar. I measured the relief with no strings on at about 12 thousandths of an inch. We know that when we put the strings on, it bends forward up to 25 thousandths of an inch. And the difference between those two figures is 13 thousandths. So that's how much the neck moves under string tension. Now, the desired relief when we get done with this thing should be around 6 thousandths. That would be ideal. 6 thousandths is 8 thousandths less than that current difference. So the shim height is going to be the fret height of 30 thousandths plus the difference in relief as it currently is, 13 thousandths. And then we have to add in the 8 thousandths more so that we get a proper relief. And that will give us a 51 thousandths shim height. This is an idealized situation where there's no spring back in the neck. So it's a safe place for us to start. It's possible I'll need to increase the heights of the shims, which, is not uncommon. You often have to do more than one setting, but this should get us right in the ballpark to begin with. And I'm not in danger of over-bending the neck, if you know what I mean. Okay, give it the juice. I'm letting it heat up and just sort of going slowly. I'm going to crank this into the full pull, sort of sneaking up on it, not wanting to shock the system, as it were. And I'm going to let this heat up for probably half an hour, 45 minutes, then turn it off, let it cool down completely, and I'll do it again after it's cooled down. Doing a second heating usually results in a better, more reliable bend. At least I've noticed that from when I'm bending sides and that kind of stuff. I'm going to turn this thing upside down now so it's less picturesque but more functional. Okay, this is very promising. After the 2 sessions of heat, I went for about an hour each time with the cool down in between. I let it sit clamped up overnight. It's now been unclamped for some time and it's remaining unchanged. The relief is now 4 thousandths, so it's been reduced by about 2/3 from the 12 that we started with. I think I'll try again tonight and put a little bit more bow into it and see if we can get it dead straight. But this is definitely better than it was. The neck heating is done now, and the neck at this point without strings is perfectly straight from the 1st to the 14th fret. To do that took 4 heatings and more shim height than I thought would be necessary, because the last stack was about 50 thousandths higher than fret height. So to straighten this neck 12 thousandths of an inch, I had to overbend 4 times that distance. It's a ratio of 4 to 1, which seems like a lot, but we're dealing with mahogany, which is pretty stable stuff. In the past I've done this with maple fender necks, with truss rods in them to help. In this case I'm working against a steel bar. I'll get to use the technique again later this month with a different neck and we'll see if results are similar. Woodworking glue from the late 60s and the 70s is like a different breed. It's not crispy like hide glue, and it's not as stable as the modern stuff. It will creep more. It's gummier, but at the same time it's harder to free. I gotta pry a bit more, at least in my experience.
I'm taking the neck off using the foam cutters, which I described a couple of videos ago. These things are working out very nicely. Came out very clean. There are no shims in this one, but it does have something which I consider a bit of a mystery. I put this up on Instagram the other day to do sort of a crowdsourcing of ideas. In some, but not all, late 60s and 70s dreadnoughts, there are a bunch of little holes on the face of the neck block. It looks like someone took out their frustrations with an ice pick, but I think it has to do with a jig that they used when spraying, basically a dovetail pin on a stick, probably with a screw in it to keep it locked in place. But there are too many holes, as if they repositioned the thing 12 times, and not every guitar has them. I don't know what it's about.
This D35 has seen more play, and in some ways it's in rougher shape than the 18, but the action and the neck are definitely in a better state. The action's currently 8/64ths, which is, it's the limit as far as I'm concerned, for most players. A lot of people would say that's far too high. On the other hand, some people function just fine at that height. But really, more than that, and you are definitely into neck reset territory. The owner is not ready for that eventuality, so we're going to push this as far as we can and keep it playing without doing a neck reset. The relief in the neck is also much less dramatic. It's 8/1000ths, which that's just fine with me. I'm not going to fool with it. For those who don't know, the D35 is a guitar that came along in the mid-60s. It was Martin's way of dealing with the dwindling supply of Brazilian rosewood, because even back then it was getting very difficult to source in quantities that they required, so they decided to go with a 3-piece back rather than 2. And that means that they could get away with resawing from 6-inch boards rather than 8. That's a substantial savings. In 1969 they stopped using Brazilian altogether, but for a few years after, and only in some cases, and randomly sometimes, they used up the stock that they had, usually on D35s like this, and this is one of those times. The center panel here is Brazilian rosewood, and the outside ones are Indian. How do I know that? It's like asking a car guy how he knows a 1970 Dodge Challenger from a 1970 Charger. If you're into these things, it's obvious. That's Dalbergia Nigra, that's Dalbergia Sissu. The bridge is lifting. I've got to take it off and put it back on. It's quite a low bridge, and it's factory original. It was never cut down, never replaced, and it's only 9/32 of an inch high, just over a quarter of an inch. Once again, this dispels the myth that there is a correct height for the bridge and a correct height for the strings over the soundboard. It was never that way. They always had a supply of different thicknesses that they pulled from, and they just picked the one that worked best with whatever happens with the neck angle. This one being on the low side, and I think 9/32 was actually the lowest, like the thinnest bridge that they made. That might be part of the reason the action is still okay after 50 years. Slightly less rotational force on the top, and it's not suffering for it. It's good and loud, and it's got good tone. The D18 is on the higher side. This is 11/32, so it's a full 1/16 of an inch taller.
So I'll pull the bridge off and re-glue it like I usually do. No surprises here. There's actually already a bridge pad overlay in this guitar to keep the string windings off the top of the saddle from a previous lowering, so I don't have to do that this time. There's a crack in the player's side upper bout on the D18, so I need to get that glued up. I've come across some rare earth bar magnets that I think would be good to hold the side in alignment, but these things are almost too powerful. They snap together from long distances in an almost cartoonish fashion, possibly with your skin between. But they work. I put in some glue and used the spool clamps to tighten things down.
Before I address the missing pickguard, I need to work on some cracks. In this era, Martin would glue their guards right to the bare wood and then put finish over top. 70's guards are a little bit thinner than what came before, but gluing to the wood directly continued to have repercussions. Even though the plastic eventually shrivels and comes away, it sticks there long enough to prevent the soundboard from moving when humidity strikes. The adjacent wood can expand and contract, but the pickguard area can't. So that leads to the infamous Martin pickguard crack. Usually it's here. In this case we've got one here on this side and one on that side. So many of the guitars built before the 1980s have this that it's considered normal. Longtime followers know that I've been on the hunt for a decent pickguard material supplier in Canada for years now. It's been hard. I can get the tortoloid stuff, which looks great, from Stumac, and the super irony there is that it was developed by a Canadian builder, Mario Prue, who's very hard to get a hold of. So I end up paying an arm and a leg for shipping. When it gets here, it's stamped Made in Canada, which feels weird. Apparently they don't have a dealer up here. Sometimes I can find decent stuff on eBay, but the guy I last bought from has disappeared, unfortunately. For the thicker guards, you know, the ones you find on 40s and 50s guitars, I'll buy sheet stock for floating archtop guards and sand it down till it's about 1 millimeter thick, and that ends up working pretty well. But I really want a reasonable brown tortoise plastic. A lot of what's on the market now has a bunch of sort of light transparent amber, which looks fine on new builds, but for replacements like this, you know, there are times when you want to hide what's underneath. This, the light stuff here is probably going to go away because of the white backing. It won't look so egregious when it's on the guitar. I mean, that would be perfectly fine. So I ordered some stock from Solo Guitars the other day. Got some tortoise and some fire stripe. They're Canadian. The price is decent for me. They're not a sponsor. I don't do the partnership thing. But if something works well, I don't mind talking about it, right? So I got a pre-made guard for dreadnoughts, and we will quickly discover something that happens a lot, is they're not all the same. This one is close, but definitely not the right size. So I'll have to trace this out as carefully as I can, and I'll make a template, and then I'll cut it from the blank sheet.
You can cut this thin guard material with scissors, but on something like this where I want it to fit inside the pre-existing void in the finish as closely as possible, it's just easier to make a routing template and fine-tune the shape on that before sticking the plastic to it and routing it off. It's just cleaner. And this is important for a good result too. After cutting it to shape, the edges need to be beveled slightly. If you don't do this, it'll always look homemade, and it'll sort of stick out like a sore thumb. Possibly make your thumb sore if it happens to slide against that sharp edge. This just softens the outline and makes it more visually... It flows into the surface of the guitar in a way that isn't distracting. Looks okay, but I should double check something before sticking it down. As I said, a lot of these guitars have issues with bridge position. I think they used a jig that registered off the front edge of the nut slot, and maybe it got knocked out of alignment at some point. In this case, the saddle slot is close, but it's about 1/16 of an inch short on the treble side, as if it has no compensation, and therefore it's liable to play sharp, and the bridge itself is slightly canted. So I'll plug the slot and reroute it. Time to take care of the back brace in the D35. Luckily it was preserved, but unfortunately one end has suffered a loss of material. I'll need to fix that. I'm going to produce a scarf joint, which is just a long diagonal gluing surface. I plane the other half so the grain aligns and glue the two together. While that dries, I'll prepare to affix the pickguard on the D18. I want to lightly sand the bare surface as it's been exposed for a long time and it's oxidized and slightly dirty. Then I'll seal it with a couple of coats of de-waxed shellac. If the guard has to come off again in the future, that'll protect the wood surface. I tape it into position, flop it back over, make sure that the inner pickguard ring is where I want it to be, and then press it lightly with a cork-backed block. To really get it stuck down, it's best to clamp it for a while. The template becomes a clamping call, and there are blocks on the inside as well. The brace is dry, so I can plane off the excess and get it into shape. It wasn't missing a lot, but that little sliver is kind of important, right down there at the end. I'll sand and clean the back surface. Regluing a long brace can be extremely fiddly work. The best way I know involves making up a jack stick with a number of turnbuckles. The issue with individual jacks is you tighten one and it loosens the others enough that they can fall down, and then you scream. To keep tension against the brace and provide counter force, I clamp a long, flexible, padded batten across the back, and then it's a question of getting things in position. The upper bar is braced against the X brace. It's very rigid and secure. Lowering the action on the D35 might be kind of tough. Someone before me cut some string slots, so I'll pull those forward a little bit more towards the back of the saddle to give as much clearance for the strings as possible, because we're looking at not much height left on there to steal from. I can get about a heavy 32nd of an inch or so.
Alright, a tale of two Martins. The D18 has a saddle that's just over 1/8 of an inch, or about 3 millimeters above the surface of the bridge. I know from experience that most guitars will settle a little bit in the week after a neck reset, and they seem to gain almost a 64th in action height over that time. So when that happens, I have enough here to work with. I can sand off a little bit. It'll still have good exposure and it'll look right. After heat pressing the neck, the relief now under string tension is 6/1000ths, which is very good. I'm happy with it. The D35 is at the opposite end of the spectrum. This is as low as a saddle can get and still do its job. There's about 1/16 of an inch exposure here, 1.5 millimeters. If I take it any lower, there won't be enough break angle there, and the strings will just slide around loose on top of the saddle. So this is it. This is the end of the road. Next step is a reset. How long will that be? Depends on what you can deal with in terms of action. We started off with 8/64ths on the bass, 7 on the treble. Now we're down to 6.5 on the bass and just over 5 on the treble, which is pretty good. It might take 10 years, it might take 15 years, but this thing's going to need a neck reset at some point. I've still got some more drop fill repairs to do on both of these guitars over the next few days. Got to let the lacquer cure and stuff. But I thought I'd put strings on them so that we can have a listen.